Hey, it's Nicole. Welcome back to the Serial Entrepreneur Show. So excited to have you tuning in with us and to meet today's guest, Sean Campbell. He is the CEO of Cascade Insights. What in the world is that? It's all about a B2B market research. And frankly, it tells me it might be cutting edge. Sean has delivered talks for Fortune 50 companies and top tier conferences. The logos on his site, folks, are all names that you would know. I'm talking all the big ones from AWS to even Salesforce. So excited to have Sean here because he is somebody who way before it was cool, way before it was mainstream, and way before 2020, wanted to create a remote first company to prove to the rest of us it's pretty efficient when you can work remotely.
Hey, if you're an entrepreneur who usually fast forwards intros just like this one, this is the podcast for you.
Serial Entrepreneurs.
Sean, welcome to the show.
Welcome. Hey, thanks for having me on.
So good to have you. I love that you are remote first and you're even outside with us today. So much to talk about there. But let me ask you the first question we ask every single guest. How would you finish this sentence? You know you're an entrepreneur when?
When you realize that there's always an end to your bank account.
Sounds like there's a story there.
I just think it's one of the things that I always tell people that are starting a business is I say, are you okay with knowing that eventually you'll run out of money? And they say, well, sure, I understand that. I said, no. The difference being self-employed and employed is that employed, we kind of delude ourselves that our job is a permanent fixture. Everybody knows that it isn't, right? You could be laid off. You could get the proverbial Zoom call of death, all this stuff. But we act as if it's probably permanent or it's within our rights to change the job, right? When you're an entrepreneur, you immediately know, every entrepreneur knows when they're out of money. It might be a year from now. It might be 2 years from now. It might be next month. I think owning a business changes your view of money. I don't know of a way it doesn't really, because you're responsible for paying for everything, technically at that point, right? My favorite very short story of that is like when I was getting started with my first business that we grew and sold with two business partners, one of whom actually started this business with me and he's now departed. A friend of my business partner's wife basically said to my business partner's wife about health insurance, she said, well, your company pays for that, right? And she was like, well, yeah, but I mean, like, it's just Scott and Bob and Sean. So it's just the same bank account. And she's like, well, yeah, but I mean, you can get the health insurance you want because the company pays for it. And so it was a running joke because every time we had like the unexpected expense of being a business owner, we would be like, yeah, but the company pays for it. So it's fine. As if that's like somebody else's money.
So before we get any further, tell us, what do you do? What business do you own?
Well, we conduct market research for B2B technology companies. So we don't deal with like consumer technologies. It's all what businesses sell to other businesses from a technology standpoint. And so that's a lot of cloud services, a lot of software, hardware, those kinds of things. And then the other thing we do is we do provide marketing services, but we're a research first company. So we're a little bit the flip of an agency, because agencies will come to us and agencies tend to, I would say they appreciate research, but to some extent it's a cost, right? Because they don't do research inside the building. So to them, it's a little bit of a cost to implement it. Like they'll come to us and they'll say like, hey, do you guys want to help us with the research? But for us, everything begins with research and then we'll turn around and sometimes help companies activate that through messaging, positioning, content, et cetera. But predominantly it's market research for technology companies.
Awesome. So for technology companies, so their software, you said their cloud services. So you're researching what the best option is for that business.
Wouldn't be the way I would put it, but it's like we get either hired for pain or opportunity is the way I put it. Like we either get hired because they did something to themselves, they shipped a poor product, they had a bad sales process, they had bad marketing, or their competitor is causing them pain because they have a better product, better marketing, better sales, or it's opportunity. So they want to go after like a new market, a new geography. They bought something that they want to merge in, AI. Every single one of our clients is having us do some kind of artificial intelligence focused research because nobody wants to be off that train.
Is there an example or a story where you're not protected by maybe some sort of NDA of some sorts or something you can give us like that would help us understand it even more?
An organization will come to us and say, I want to understand my buyer personas better. And I want to understand where they look for information and how they make decisions with each other. And what do they think is most important for the type of solution that we're looking at? Or we'll do win-loss research where we're calling lost customers, trying to understand why they said goodbye to the client at some point, or churned customers. Or we do message testing research where somebody will say, are these the right messages to send to the market? Are we saying the right things to the right people? Or we might even do ICP research. Like, do I actually have the right people that I'm targeting with my sales and marketing? And so inside that, it's qualitative and quantitative research. A lot of qualitative though, because in B2B, it's really, really hard to generate a large survey because you're typically targeting really, really tight markets. You're not just like talking to Gen Alpha, and you could go throw a rock and hit somebody that you want to have participate in your survey. So for us, there's a lot of in-depth interviews that we do with people. There's a lot of virtual focus group type work, things like that. And then the final click down is most organizations that we work with, we're working with a marketer more often than not. And they're trying to impact like a go-to-market plan or some kind of content strategy they have or a messaging framework they're trying to build. And we're trying to give them the market's view of that. And we will either talk to their customers or even competitor customers if need be. Because eventually you get pretty narrow, right? So somebody will come to us and say, I want to talk to CIOs who are in FinServ companies who are deploying artificial intelligence solutions to impact investment opportunities that mid-market companies that happen to be oil and gas companies. And like, you're down to like 6 people. It's not that bad, but it's not Gen Alpha that went to the mall yesterday, but they don't go to the mall. So like, I guess that would be impossible. It's funny.
Good luck finding 6 people.
There are no Gen Alphas that go to the mall, but like Gen X that goes to the mall. Sure, we still probably do. And by the way, the place I grew up before Oregon was Chicago. So just passing it along. So Dalton, Cal City, South Holland.
Yeah. Dalton.
So,
wow. What years? So that's where my husband's side of the family all comes from.
Really?
Yeah.
That's wild. I never talked to anybody that's from Dalton anymore. I was there from, basically born 1970. We had a small stint in Georgia and Virginia when my dad was in the Guard, but we were in Dalton all the way up through, we moved to South Holland, like maybe freshman year of high school, but we were on the part of South Holland that was really close to Dalton. So I still felt like I was pretty close. And then eventually we moved out to Lansing, which felt far enough out. And then eventually ended up in Oregon after marrying my wife. So
those are national listeners. These are all the cities essentially on the south suburbs of Chicago. Just so you guys
totally
know.
right.
So those,
Yeah, these are all. If anybody's listening and they've seen the movie Rudy, just go watch the opening. That's Whiting, Indiana, but it's the same vibe in Rudy. Is like that's who I grew up with. Like every dad was a cop, a fireman. You know what I mean? Worked at the plant. Yeah, like that's all the dads. Drove a bread truck. My grandfather drove a bread truck, and I love having been from there. By the way, I absolutely love having been from there.
Wow.
I mean, if you hear someone say Dalton or South Holland,
it's pretty rare. Yeah, I don't even normally bring up Dalton because they don't know what it is. I just say like on the southeast side of Chicago, and then I make some comment about it being a Cubs fan. So that's about it. Small world.
That's good. Great.
Such a small world. Yeah, they were there probably, or some part of the family was there while you were there. So that's pretty wild. Okay,
that's cool.
What led you to entrepreneurship? Here you grew up around all of these, firemen and bread trucks and all of that. I think that I grew up with a lot of those, but my family, they all owned something, aunts, uncles, everybody. So I never actually understood. What do you mean your dad works third shift? What do you mean? Steel mill? What?
Right.
Even though it was all around me, I was always so puzzled. So tell me, what led you to where you are?
Well, one last Dalton thing, because I don't get to talk about it, and then we'll be off, I swear. So if anybody's listening, talk about small population. So if somebody's listening and they're like, I'm from Dalton too. So go to Facebook and go to Dalton Memories, The Way We Were. The guy is basically living in the 70s and 80s in Dalton. This guy posts every pizza joint you ever went to, the photos of. He's interviewed and talked to everybody. Seriously, I'm not like a big follower of those kinds of groups on Facebook, but this dude is like living my childhood on Facebook. It's crazy. So you should go check it out. So how did I get here? I got here because I am pathologically incapable of learning something and not wanting to teach it. I have been that way ever since Father Boyvin, when I was in second grade, turned to my mother when I wasn't in the room and said, he sounds like a little professor. Now, he didn't mean it in that like sitcom way where you want to go choke the little professor because he's just obnoxious. He meant it more like the kid loves to learn. And I do. I'm an avid learner. But the difference for me is like, I immediately want to go teach somebody it. All my hobbies are that. I do announcements at the church. Anytime I'm fishing, it's like, I want more people on the boat so I can teach them fishing, right? Skiing, it's the same thing. And so I end up getting out of college and wanting to be a college professor. And I'm about to get married. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to do the PhD program thing because I wasn't sure how poor I wanted to be. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. My wife, who to this day says she would have followed me to Waterloo, Iowa, where the PhD program was. I said, let me go teach, but teach computers, which also dates the story because we don't say that anymore. But in the late 90s, you used to say, well, I'm going to go teach computers. So I went off and I taught people Windows for Workgroups and Word when mice were new. I literally had a student once use it as a foot pedal. I am not making that up. and I had to take it off the floor, take their sewing machine perspective.
I was going to say sewing machine.
I don't know
Sewing
what they were
machine.
thinking. Seen people do all kinds of strange stuff. And then I ended up teaching databases and I ended up teaching programming. And along that journey, about 4 or 5 years into it, I said, I'd really like to become an independent trainer, because that was in that era when Microsoft was even more dominant than it is today. Ultimately, that was an era where everybody wanted to learn about Microsoft tech. So there was just these armies. You could go off and be an independent trainer and train people on it. So I started a company with 2 other guys. We had no plans to have employees. The company was called Tree Leaf Solutions. What was interesting, though, is we had a relationship with Microsoft, and Microsoft was paying us to produce this technical content. And so the very first account I ever sold as an entrepreneur was Microsoft, when they were 97% of computing. And the benefit to me was I didn't realize the education I was getting. I'm sitting in the company that is basically changing the world technologically. And I'm, at that point, creating what they used to call technology evangelism, which was like education around new technology. Guy Kawasaki called it that for Apple. So we built a company doing that, had about 25 people, all remote. Then we sold that company, and then I started Cascade. And at the end of the first company, we were doing a lot of work on competitive analysis of technology. And we said, my business partner, Scott, who was in that first company with me, we said, why don't we found a company that does competitive analysis of technology? Anyway, you roll the clock a little farther forward. 4 years later, we say, let's go make a full market research services firm on top of that. Let's expand beyond just competitive. And then another number of years after that, we said, let's add on activating the research through marketing services. And that's where we are today. And Scott exited the business in both cases. He exited this business about a year ago. But if you draw a thread through it all, I'm even doing things a professor does. I do research, which is what professors do. And a lot of service firm owners consider themselves teachers and educators. And so in a very weird way, that's how I ended up doing this, because I like teaching and I like educating. Didn't get a business degree, had no plans to be an entrepreneur, zero. I just liked being independent. It's also partly why I built a remote company. I really wanted to grow a strong family. And for better or worse, mine was a little bit of a train wreck at times when I grew up. I knew that if I was independent, I would have a little more control about where I spend my time. And I know that was a big drive for me all the way through.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get into a couple things here. Because you support other businesses, I wanted to ask you, what do you see that happens when someone is either distracted with their next idea or the thing that they bring to you? How do you see people repeatedly taking ideas and winning, or coming to you with an idea that then you can help set them up for success?
Well, here's an interesting thing about what we do. And we've even trademarked this, which is probably goofy because I don't know if I'll ever really leverage the trademark. We have a phrase, we say, we deliver bad news to good people. And it's at the heart, I think, of owning a market research firm, is that when people reach out to you for market research, there's a few dynamics that must have already played out. And some of this, by the way, is a little bit channeled from a guy, David Maister, who wrote a book called Managing the Professional Services Firm, which is still an amazing read. Unfortunately, the guy's book after that was called Strategy and the Fat Smoker. I have no idea why he chose that branding. That book was not as successful.
Shocking.
He did his research. Yeah.
I
Yes,
think
yes.
he did, right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
But
yeah.
seriously, Managing the Professional Service Firm is one of the best things you could read. And so he does this thing where he talks about it, and he's like, when a buyer comes to you, they're a little insecure and they're a little threatened, and they had to expose they didn't know something. And they had to basically share that there's some risk to their organization. And all of those things are true when people come to us for a market research study, right? I mean, they fundamentally have to admit that they didn't know something. Otherwise, why do research to begin with, right? And so I think that's the first problem. And that's where the second piece comes in. We deliver bad news to good people, is that we are not usually the bringers of good news, because fundamentally you didn't want to buy good news, right? If all I did is come in and say your branding is great, you're like, thanks for the 50K. Why did you do that? Or yep, we talked to all your lost customers. You couldn't have kept them anyway. Good riddance. Okay. Well, what? Or yeah, your buyer personas, you got it nailed. You seem to have messaging that everybody would love. Now, there's a certain validity and, I guess comfort level that comes out of, saying, oh, you're doing a good job, right? So we have this tension where we almost come in automatically saying the company has done something wrong. And so to your point about what makes it work is they have to be willing to listen. And that's not always true. We'll roll in and the junior person has hired us and the senior person is like, no, I love our brand.
Yeah.
Everybody hates your brand, man. Everybody
Yes.
does. Everyone. I know your
Yes.
grandmother
Yeah, they do.
likes it and she gave you the idea
Yes.
for the tagline, but no, it's horrible. right? Or like we were talking to a client once, and if people have ever heard the phrase digital transformation, it's way overused. That's why I brought it up. And a guy said in a meeting when one marketer was advocating for the use of the phrase, and we were saying, I wouldn't use it, not from what we did in the focus group testing of that message. One of the sales guys pops up and says, I think there should be a swear jar in this building every time we use the phrase digital transformation. It is so tired. And like, that dynamic happens all the time. Or like I had a group of clients that we were getting down to us versus somebody else in terms of who they were going to pick. Normally this doesn't happen to us, but they put like 17 people on the call to like have us do the last, like, who are you and should you pick us kind of call, right? And at one point, they're kind of just like chewing the fat back and forth, and they're talking about what their concerns are with the research and whether it'll be meaningful and all the things they wanted to cover. And, one guy, he's kind of an East Coast, he totally read like he came from Jersey. Sorry, Jersey. But he's like, hey, so I mean, just ultimately, like, why should we hire you? And I don't know why I said it, partly because, growing up on the south side of Chicago, there's the whole like second city vibe with New York, right? So there's a little bit of like a chip.
Yeah.
And so I looked at him probably without thinking, and Inner Chicago came out, and I go, I don't know, maybe to stop you people from arguing. And I heard we got hired because of that. I also heard I ticked off 3 or 4 people out of the 17 by saying it, but I guess not enough.
Not enough. Yep.
Not enough. Because it was like, well, there's your answer. You could all get on 7 more phone calls like this.
Yeah.
And you could all argue
Yeah.
for the next 7 days, years.
Right.
Right. But then what's the good people part? I think ultimately, if you have the courage to look to your peers left and right and say, honestly, we don't know enough, man. I think you're probably a reasonably good person. My guess is you probably make other relatively decent, conscientious decisions at other times during your day. Because there's a certain bravery that comes up with sitting in a conference room and saying, I think we should spend money to answer the questions we don't have any flippant idea what the answers are to, right? That's hard. And the bigger the company, the harder it is.
Right.
So I think that's it. I think it's a lot of courage, and I think it's a lot of willingness to hear. And that's not to say that everybody does listen. I mean, I had a student once say to me when I was teaching in an MBA program about 10 years ago, he said, kind of snarky, typical 24-year-old MBA kid, so do you not get paid if your advice doesn't work out? And I just looked at him. I was like, oh, Padawan, you don't have any idea what you're talking about. I'm like, there's no way. I can't make the company act on what we give them. I cannot.
Mm-hmm.
It's Microsoft. It's Google. It's Salesforce. What I can do, though, is I can be a truth teller. And that's the one piece of thing I tell everybody around here. I'm like, as long as we are telling the truth, nothing we can do wrong.
So how do you navigate those seas? Because I've been in counsel for larger corporations. I've been in the room with some.
Your stories are painful, man. They're painful.
I know they are. And exactly, Sean's like, oh God, the attorney's in the room now. So I'm sure he's dealt with some of my folk before. And sometimes you get these people who have done things the way they've always done things because that's what we do. Auntie liked it. Auntie named it, like you said. How have you dealt with some of these organizations are successful organizations, I imagine. Yet, like you said, you have to be the one to come in there and bring essentially sometimes the bad news. Like, you're not as great as you thought you were. Let me tell you why.
This is going to be a simple answer, but I think it is legitimately the most effective answer. You simply make them stare at what customers and competitor customers are saying. And I have a very specific example that relates to this, but I think that has universally been the unlock. And it's not a chart. It's not a graph. I mean, sometimes it is if we do a quantitative study, but interestingly enough, as much as I think the quantitative work we do is valuable, it doesn't always have the same life-changing effect because it's numbers and people can kind of pick and choose what they want to deal with there. Or they can pick at the number itself and be like, well, how about this and how about that? But a quote isolated on a slide, it's hard to navigate around. The story I have to share on that, this is with one of those very, very large companies you mentioned, and they were doing very bad in the UK with sales, horrendously bad. And what we came to realize is that they had shipped a bunch of young Silicon Valley executives over to the UK, and they were just aggressively pounding the street and just annoying the crud out of every single Londoner in the city. Yet they were still buying the solution because the solution was number one in its space, like by a long shot. There wasn't anybody else remotely close. And so there was this quote on a slide that I just let isolate. I just let hang on a single slide when I read it out to I think her title was VP of Insights at the time. I said, this quote's really, really important. I wish I could remember it exactly, but he said something like, the second you are not number one, I am never buying you again because your salespeople are such jerks. And it was a little more colorful than that. And so anyway, this VP of Insights looks at me and she just says, without missing a beat, so our salespeople are assholes. And I said, yep. And see, at that moment, I had a couple choices, right? I could do the market researcher. Well, based on the facts and, I could inject 1,000 weasel words. This may be true. I mean, that is one quote, but we seem like it's indicative. I just looked at her and realized, yeah, they are. Because everything we heard is they are. And so here's the punchline to it. Basically, she had the ear of the CEO of this like Fortune 100 tech company. And so she showed me the deck that she wrote for the CEO that was the summation of our deck. And it had a slide that said, our salespeople are assholes. And the UK head of sales was fired.
Wow.
And so I realized that really what she was asking me is, could you tell me what's the fundamental thing I need to change in a way that an organization our size can't ignore?
Right.
I
Right.
just gave her the truth. And that happens to us all the time. All the time. And we just have to say, in so many words, hey, I'm sorry, but that's the truth.
Yeah.
You can ignore it and go make a different decision. We'll see where you're at in a year.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So good. So good. When was the last time you were distracted in your business? Maybe there was a shiny object or a squirrel, not just because you're outside, but maybe it led to your best idea or maybe it led to your worst.
One, I want to be clear. I have no intention of disparaging my ex-business partner publicly. So this is all in the lane of what can people learn that's meaningful without, getting into any kind of sticky wickets. And I've gone through it twice now. And there are some things you have to consider if your co-owner exits a business. One, you immediately have a parental change, if you think of it that way, because in a business that's jointly held, the employees can always kind of pick the parent they like talking to the most. Well, all of a sudden that changes overnight. There's only one parent. So you've got people who, for their own reasons, perhaps very good ones, they tended to go to one business partner versus another. Well, now they have to talk to the other parent, and there's probably reasons they felt more comfortable with the other parent, just like in life with your kids. And now all of a sudden they've got to talk to you. So you have to figure out, like, how do you communicate your decision-making style? And how do you go about it? I used to handle this actually in the company, real brief story. I used to handle this when we were jointly held by, if somebody came over to my side of the company, like maybe they were going from the research side over to become like a seller doer, let's say, and I was going to coach them. I had this document that I had people on my team write up that was how to work with Sean, that my wife has seen, that I have never seen. To this day, I don't know what's in it.
You don't know what's
Every
in it?
time
I have a user manual for my team, but I know what's in my user manual for the most
and I
part, and
have
I
that
try to.
too. I have
Yeah.
a single source of truth that's like the
Okay.
consulting guide, but
Okay.
like this was how to work with me, like not like only how to work with me, but like more the, what does he mean when he says this, and what,
Yes.
what they care about, and what, all that stuff that you want to learn. For years, I used to just have people read it. I'd say, like, your peers probably have a good read on me, so go read that before you come over to my side. And that's one thing. I think the other thing is, people are going to have a lot of questions, right? They're going to worry, what does it mean for the business? They're going to worry, what does it mean for them? They're going to want to have a lot of time with you. You're going to have to make time for that. The worst part, I would say, though, is the clients. I have to be fair. Clients aren't always the nicest, as probably anybody listening to one of these shows knows. And I love my clients, but sometimes they're not the nicest. And, if a business partner exits, they will sometimes ask the least fun questions in the world, that honestly don't make a lot of sense. They'll say, like, so, are things going to be different? Can we be trusted? And you're like, wait a minute, like, I'm still here. The whole team's still here. I think that was the hardest part, is you basically are forced to re-justify yourself to the market when a
Right.
business partner leaves. And on the other hand, I get it. I do get it. Like, they have their right to ask those questions, but some people weren't super cool about it, to be honest.
Yeah.
In the end, it all worked out in terms of, like, we have great client relationships, but it's interesting how people react to that kind of change.
I think like a business owner probably more often than I think like an attorney, frankly. And one of the things I've advised people that are going through a tumultuous time, I'll say, as partners, is sometimes you just have to know when the date is, but nobody else does. I've positioned companies for a restructuring whereby somebody has left the company and the plan might have started a year or two earlier and nobody knew, but it's because you had to build the storyline to maintain clients. You had to build the storyline to maintain the culture, to maintain the personnel, to maintain, your employees and whatnot. Otherwise, if it happens abruptly, or even worse, if it happens on not so great terms, it allows too much, I'll call it opinion, of people to come in and say what their narrative is that they want, whether it's because they want to reduce price now, or they want to look for other options and shop you, whether it's employees wanting to look for a different opportunity within the company, or vice versa, even leave the company. There's so much different stuff there. And
there's a million things to think about. Although what I would say is that assumes something that wasn't true in my case, at least the second time, because my partner left to go work for a competitor. But I do understand that if it's a different kind of departure, you can kind of come up with a really good battle plan and lay that out and think about it. And yes, I would 100% advocate for that.
So let's talk about, you brought up about how that changes teams. I love the parent example. I remember when I still worked in corporate that as we grew from a smaller office to larger and larger across 12 states, I remember people saying, oh, well, now I got to go talk to mom and dad, right? Or like, I only feel good when I'm talking with dad. So I thought that was a really good example. But can you talk to me about doing that and doing that remotely when a time when not everybody understood remote work? What makes people a success? How can they set themselves up?
Well, I'm basically missional about remote work. I don't know how it's not better. I've done it long before it was cool. And it was a net detriment when I started doing it 20 plus years ago, because they were always like, what, you don't have an office? And the Jersey, Southside Chicago part of me would sometimes quip, yeah, you could pay for it. Yeah. Sometimes it would take people a while to figure that out. You know why? Because they're like thinking, well, doesn't the company pay for it?
Doesn't the company pay for that?
Yeah. That's called you, client, paying for it.
I've actually written that entire marketing paragraph I've actually wrote for another agency on how to help sell why they don't have one, because they...
Right. Yeah. And so it was a net negative for a long time. But the reason I'm pretty missional about it is I don't know a bigger gift humanity could give the world than better families, because a lot of good things come out of that. And one of the better ways to have that happen is if the parents are around. And that's not my opinion. I mean, you can go look at ChatGPT or whatever you use researching data. If somebody's listening, it won't be hard to find a number of articles that say the presence of the parents are good for the children. I genuinely think I'm giving people the opportunity, and I say it that way specifically for reasons you might guess, to have a better home life, better family. I can't guarantee it. There's obviously, like we heard stories during COVID of things that were bad because everybody was in the same house. Like that's way above my pay grade to fix, right? But ultimately, especially with kids, right? Presence trumps everything.
Yeah.
And if you're there when they pop off the bus, you're going to get a half an hour story of what happened during the day, as opposed to 8:50 at night. And then there's all the issues with the commute and all the other stuff that's been talked about before. So that's huge for me. But in terms of what's made it work over the years, one thing is you have to focus on organizing really everything, like the single source of truth documents you put together, just communication around the company around principles over process. It doesn't mean you don't have process, but the book of process always runs out of pages. And because it does, with remote employees, there's always that moment where, what do I do next? And if they have principles to follow, they will always have at least the ability to navigate roughly in the direction they need to, right? It's kind of like steering a boat, because I like fishing, right? You don't steer boats in perfectly straight lines. There's wind and current and waves, but you still drive toward the dock. But it's not like a car where you're just basically locked in a spot. And so those principles are really, really, really important. The other thing is hire people who are very good at written communication, because most things start async in a remote company. And if somebody can't communicate well and concisely, like Mark Twain once said, I would have written you a shorter letter, but I didn't have the time.
Yep.
Everything is going to be worse. Everything. The comms with the clients are going to be worse. The internal comms are going to be worse. And that's one thing you can't really change. Like a client of mine once said, when everything went bad in COVID and everybody went home, he literally quipped to me. He said, I had no idea how dumb my colleagues were until they had to write me to explain everything. The third thing I would say, and it's kind of related, you have to set up a culture where people are completely, utterly unafraid to admit their ignorance. And most cultures don't have that. And I know that in spades, because every time we hire somebody, it takes them about like a month to figure out that we actually believe it. Because in a remote company, I think we will find when we get done doing all the studies, because I think sociologists must have just had a field day with like everything with COVID and remote. We're going to find that, you know, where the productivity was lost? When they didn't know what to do next. Do you know what fixes that? They ask somebody. But here's the difference. In an office, what do? hey, Bob, I'm struggling. Could you, maybe, I'll mostly handle it, I think, but could you imagine writing that as a Slack message? You can't, right? So what do you write? You write, I don't know what I'm doing. And you know what you do? You send it to your boss. Well, last time I checked, like the number of those you think your boss knows about are a way to figure out you're going to get fired. So you have to create a culture that's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay
Wow.
to the minute you get stuck, go help. And what I find is nobody believes it. But where it starts is actually getting them out of that fear of having to write down, I'm stuck. The only other thing I'd say about remote is really train your middle managers on how to manage remote, because I think it's the biggest unfair get out of jail free card corporate America got in all this, because they all were like, we got to all go back to the office. Well, we're going back because you paid for the lease for that big building. I know that's part of the problem. But like, aside from that, we're going back to the office because you say there wasn't any productivity and you blame the end worker alone without any other qualifiers. Now,
Right.
whether or not that's even true is a separate point. But you know who never
Right.
gets blamed? The
Right.
middle manager. Never. And the middle manager was managing by sight. And here's what's weird about that. The minute you quit managing by sight, what ends up happening instead is you're forced to actually create metrics, rubrics, analytics, principles, guidelines, all in a single source of truth. And guess what? That works whether you're in the office or not. Probably makes the office even better.
Yeah.
But because you were managing by sight and these weird, like, hey, I don't know what I should do, Mary, next, conversations, I think in the end, if you build up that muscle, you're actually better off. And the very last thing I'd say about remote is somebody posted this on something I posted on LinkedIn, and I completely agree with it. He said, how in the world can remote companies ultimately not be better? And the argument was because they just draw from a bigger talent base. I mean, hey, like we brought up Dalton a lot. I love Dalton.
Yes.
If all I had to draw on was Dalton, nothing against Dalton. You know what I mean? When I was growing up, there's only certain types of people, certain types of thinking. It's true of everywhere in the country. We make fun of it every day on every comedy special, right? I feel like I have a much more diverse company just because I'm remote.
I'm still stuck in the very beginning when you told us that we had to be able to communicate effectively in short format to be able to get the. I'm thinking as Nicole's laughing, like Matt can't do that. Matt is
Just
incapable.
put the Mark Twain quote over your desk, right?
Exactly.
Just leave that there.
It's funny, you said like to hire for people who can learn from best written communication. I was thinking, you know what? I need the research to have clients who actually are good with the written communication, because no matter what, I'll make sure my team has great written communication for clients. Did they read all? Just 3 points. That we try not to give them 18, but 3. Sometimes I'm like, didn't you use the template? Oh yeah, I used the template. Isn't the same template? It says the same thing for all the. Oh yeah, but there will always be a client or two that, man, you wish that you could almost vet them. Can they read the whole email?
Well, yeah, well, that's a separate thing. Do clients
Yes,
actually
it
read
is.
everything we send them? No.
Yes. Okay, so tell me, Sean, what is one of the key lessons you've learned as an entrepreneur? Maybe it's a mantra you find yourself saying again and again.
Read stuff you disagree with.
Ooh.
Because nobody does. Nobody does. It doesn't mean I always agree with it, but I do actually really try to understand it.
Let me ask you this, Sean. How would you define your entrepreneurial success? Or how do you know when you've made it?
This is a good one coming from the guy whose first client was Microsoft.
I don't think you graduate till it's over. I'm on year 24 now. I learn stuff every year. I'm challenged by new stuff every year. I know some people have an exit, some people have a plan, or this like once we reach Mars or whatever, and and God bless them for it. That's great. But to me, I'm just here for the ride, and I'll graduate when it's done and I retire.
He's still in the school learning reference. You see that? Did you see that, Nicole?
saw that.
He'll graduate when it's over.
I
It was
caught
great.
it.
I
Yep.
caught it. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sean, for continuing it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Where do we get to learn more about you?
Just go to cascadeinsights.com. You can find all the contact info in the world you want. And if somebody found something of interest or just wants to share memories from Dalton, they can just email me at Sean@cascadeinsights.com.
Great. We'll
Nice.
include it in the show notes. That's perfect.
Nice. Thanks, Sean.
See you soon.
Thanks.
Okay.
Appreciate
All
it,
right.
man.
Take
Have a
it
good
easy.
one.
Hey, it's Nicole, and that's the end of the interview. But stick around. This is the part where Matt and I break it all down and give you our favorite takeaways. Listen in.
The first takeaways I have was the research, right? Sometimes we think of researchers as quantitative. Certainly, I like data. However, a part of my research when we take on certain clients, certain levels, We try to do qualitative, which is what he does a lot more of, which is talking to real humans and then putting that information back in front of our clients. I remember reading a quote one time that people will even believe a lie if they've read it so many times. But if they know it's the truth, right? Like if my client knows that another client of theirs said this statement, it echoes whatever has been in their own head. It echoes whatever their team has said, maybe what another client has said. I think it's so powerful to remind people that our businesses are about people. And the more you can hear from them or actually ask a question and wait for their feedback, long-winded or short, it's so important, so impactful to really the bottom line. At the end of the day, we're all here about that bottom line. And when we can actually hear from our clients and not be afraid to ask the question, which was another big theme for me on how much he wants to surround himself or create places where people can just ask the question or be wrong. I thought that was really, really smart, which leads me to point number 2, which is about how missional he is about remote work. Thoughts on both of
Well,
those?
I'll say real quick, just going back to point 1, when he said the quote of that specific person in London, that made me think of how much we can look at analytics. I can look at, numbers and say, oh, it's only 2% of our clients aren't happy with this or whatever. But when you read a real human being saying, hey, you suck, this is why you suck, it hits you. We don't do this because we have nothing else better to do. No, because we're passionate about it. We want to do this. We want to be committed to something that wants to change the world maybe, or at least make a difference in some capacity. At a minimum, we want to be able to serve our client at a high level. And when you read word for word, you suck.
Can't wait till you're second.
Yeah, can't wait till you're second. Well, I was summing it up, but when you read that, like, oh, it has to hit you. But yeah, back to point number 2, remote work. Like, so much great thought process regarding culture is what I thought when I heard this. How he's able to verbalize like how your culture needs to be and how you have to have from day one. I would call it a safe place for people to be able to work and learn, because there is some learning on the job, regardless of how much we want A-list employees, top-notch talent coming into your company. They have to be able to learn what it is you do, how you do it, like all those dynamics. And I don't know if we were brought up in that environment to give people a safe place to do that. Does that make sense? I don't know if that,
Yeah, no, I think it does because people want to get it right. My team, Smart Cookie Media here, we call our clients Smart Cookies because they are, especially if they hire us. I digress. And really, it's about a thread that runs through is that these business owners, and many of them are B2B, they want to get it right. So it's really hard sometimes until they get to know us or until, well, anything. I mean, really, it's about getting to know us or trusting us with their baby, their business. They just want to get it right until then. It's why marketing for B2B is also hard. We've talked about on the show, even your own examples. It's really hard to show up and be like, I didn't really know how to do this, or my sales weren't always great, or I wasn't sure how to run this process. That's hard to admit when you are supposed to constantly be admitting like, I got the answers. I know all the things. And so being that place where people can show up and ask the question, cool. And not just employees though, but also his customers, and then be coachable with it too, because, it's a consultation. They can just take the information. It's just research. Like they can just take it and say, next, let's go find something that we do agree with, right? And so throughout every bit, whether it was about his own employees or about clients, I think it's about, can we all admit, I don't know everything? And I meant to share a quote with him that I learned in one of my last corporate gigs from somebody who did a whole lot of things wrong. And I'm not just talking about when we worked together, just, got a few things wrong in life. He said, Nicole, we don't have to be right. We just have to do right. And I think that's really, really powerful when you think about people who do or don't want to get it right. Like, you don't have to be right. It's okay. Just make sure you're doing right. Make sure you're doing right by others.
I don't have anything else to add than that. That's good. I like that. That's a good little quote to end on. I think we should just end on that, unless you got something else. I don't know. Do you have something else you want to add?
The only thing I got to add is, hey, friends, if you're still listening, we really appreciate it.
Keep listening.
You've been listening to the Serial Entrepreneur Show, produced by the team here at Smart Cookie Media.